Mr. Speaker, Canadians for the first time have reason to worry about the future of their Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The government eliminated the Court Challenges program, which protected the rights of the most vulnerable and francophone communities with their schools and hospitals. By acting that way, this government has clearly shown its firm intention to empty the Charter of all its meaning. Why is the government acting in this thoughtless and careless way with respect to our Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, it's quite the opposite. I'm proud that despite the budget cutbacks, we've preserved all funding in the budget for official languages. And, Mr. Speaker, I can assure the Leader of the Opposition that we intend to continue meeting our constitutional obligations. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Preserving our official language is one thing, but normal citizens don't have the resources behind them that organized lobby groups do when they go to court.
That's right.
In 2004, the Supreme Court of Canada made an important decision about our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. A case in which the National Citizens Coalition, headed by the Prime Minister, the present Prime Minister, sought to advance the interests of the powerful. The Court Challenges program allowed other Canadians to have their say and defeat those interests, Mr. Speaker. Is the destruction of the Court Challenges program today payback time for losing that famous case, Harper versus Canada, Mr. Speaker?
The Right Honourable, the Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I fail to see the connection that the honourable member has drawn. What I can tell him is this, Mr. Speaker, that this government doesn't need to pay liberal lawyers to sue the government when we don't respect the law. We intend to respect our legal and constitutional obligations.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
This is nonsense. Well, as we're talking about paying in court, Mr. Speaker, at the very time this government's acting so firmly against the Charter, it's appointing Conservative Party activists to be judges in Alberta, Quebec, and New Brunswick. And while the Conservatives destroy the rights of individual Canadians before the courts, they're naming their partisan supporters to high judicial office. Mr. Speaker, this may be payback time for Conservative operatives, but what does it mean for the integrity of our justice system, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I note, for example, that Mr. Justice MacDonald was first appointed to the bench by another government. He distinguished himself on the provincial court, and the government appointed him to the Queen's Bench on the basis of his demonstrable legal abilities. And if he goes through the entire list, Mr. Speaker, he will find that there were actually some Liberals on the list that have been appointed.
The Honourable Member for Westmount Ville-Marie. Order. Mr. Speaker, the new minority government has announced cutbacks to the Court Challenges program. It's also trying to shut up an independent voice in the legal system by eliminating the Law Reform Commission. All this when the government is appointing Conservatives to the bench. Canadians have grounds to be concerned. Does the Prime Minister recognize that he's changing our legal system for purely ideological and partisan reasons? The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Speaker, I think that if we look at the list of individuals who were appointed, those individuals were all on lists compiled by that government and their advisors. So to suggest somehow that these individuals came from some list is simply misleading this House and misleading Canadian people. These individuals were appointed on the basis of merit, and that's what we intend to do in the future.
Member for Westmount Ville-Marie. Mr. Speaker, appointments to the bench show how it's important to know someone in the minority government. A former president of the Conservative Party and the spouse of another were recently appointed to the Quebec Superior Court. Can the Prime Minister tell us if from now on you have to be a Conservative to be appointed to the bench? The Honourable Justice Minister.
I find it interesting that this member would disparage members of the judiciary in this fashion, coming from a list of, in fact, that these individuals, the Liberal government, the past Liberal government, compiled the list. These individuals were taken out of there. And I understand that, in fact, that one of the individuals that was appointed by this government to the bench was a president of the Laurier Club.
The Honourable Member for Laurier Sainte Marie. Mr. Speaker, the transitional measures for EI, the EI map, end in October 2006. The transitional measures are supposed to alleviate the effects of the redrawing of the map which have affected seasonal workers. The current EI system is performing poorly in terms of meeting regional workers' needs. Will the Prime Minister at least commit to renewing the transitional provisions until a more fair map is drawn? The Honourable Minister of Social Development.
Mr. Speaker, we recognize that there are certain inequities between various regions. We're waiting, Mr. Speaker, to make an informed decision based on the new Stats Canada data that's coming up.
Good for you.
The Honourable Member for Laurier Sainte Marie. It ends on October 7th. Let's not forget that. The House Standing Committee on Human Resources tabled its report recommending amendments to the EI regime, and the government flatly refused to follow through on those recommendations. How does the Prime Minister explain that the 13 billion surplus isn't enough to allow him to improve the EI system in response to the calls of the unemployed for years? Is this yet another decision based on purely ideological grounds? The Honourable Minister of Social Development.
Mr. Speaker, we're taking a look, as you know, at all of our programs. We want to make sure that the employment insurance program responds to the needs of all Canadians. That's why we just launched our pilot project on the 5 weeks. That's why we extended the definition of eligibility for the EI compassionate care. That's why, Mr. Speaker, we will be meeting the deadlines that are necessary to ensure that all Canadians get the benefits they need and deserve under EI.
The Honourable Member for Chambly-Bordua. Mr. Speaker, last week, when the budget surplus was used to pay down the debt, there was $2 billion coming from the EI fund. As in past years, the government used that money, and by doing so, it caused the unemployed to pay down the debt, even though thousands of them are no longer eligible for benefits. The Honourable Minister for Social Development.
Mr. Speaker, we do have a new mechanism put in place to minimize any surplus or loss in the EI account. We want to make sure that we do everything possible to match EI revenues with EI expenditures. Last year we had a better year than expected in our economy, so the EI claims were lower than usual, and that's a good thing, Mr. Speaker. But this new mechanism has only had one opportunity to be put into use. We look forward to it being reviewed again so that we can best match revenues with income responsibly for Canadians.
That's responsible.
The Member for Chambly-Bordua. The problem is not reducing the surpluses, it's how those surpluses are used. In the 12 past years, over $50 billion was redirected from EI, and vulnerable regions with seasonal work, these are the areas hardest hit by cuts to EI. How can the Government of Canada maintain this ideology when a significant part of debt repayment is being paid for at the expense of the poorest, people who don't even qualify for benefits? The Honourable Minister of Social Development.
Well, Mr. Speaker, if we minimize the surplus in the EI account, that means that there's more money available for all Canadians. That means that fewer Canadians have to pay taxes. That means that we can do things like lowering EI premiums for employers and for the employees who need it so much. And that means more money in the economy, That's better for everyone, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Vancouver East.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, it's been 1 full week since the public inquiry confirmed the injustices experienced by Mahar Arar and his family. At the time, the member for Malpat, then Solicitor General, stood in this House time and time again and claimed the RCMP had done no wrong. Mr. Speaker, it was his responsibility to stop the illegal leaks and to speak out publicly. Why is this government dragging its feet, and why is no one assuming ministerial responsibility for this tragic case? Why not?
The Honourable, the Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and nothing could be farther from the truth. This government has done things already, and it continues to do things. And this government has instructed counsel to contact Mr. Arar's lawyer to begin negotiations, and that contact has been made.
The Honourable member for Vancouver East.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it is unbelievable that this government continues to shame itself by refusing to apologize to Mahar Arar. And even sadder, no one has been held accountable. Now, the Accountability Act has provisions for a public prosecutor. Will this government commit today that the first investigation by the public prosecutor will be into possible breaches of the Security of Information Act by ministers of the former Liberal government?
The Honourable, the President of the Treasury Board.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we do support independent prosecution when violations happen in federal law. That's why it's so important we pass the Federal Accountability Act. Now, in this battle to bring more accountability, we have received good amount of support from the New Democratic Party. What we need is support from the Liberal Senate, Mr. Speaker, to finally pass the Federal Accountability Act and finally let the corrupt practices of the previous Liberal regime be part of Canadian history, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable member for Ottawa South.
Mr. Speaker, 2 weeks ago, the Minister of Justice appointed Bruce MacDonald, a well-known Conservative fundraiser and organizer, as a federal judge. Now we learn that for 12 straight years, he personally donated over $11,000 to the Reform Alliance Conservative parties. The Minister of Justice has stated that he will never support judicial appointments where, quote, who you know gets you to the bench. By making one of his party's top bagmen a federal judge, will the Minister now admit that he's badly broken his promise?
Honourable, the Minister of Justice.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Justice MacDonald was already a member of the bench. He was appointed to the bench by another government. Justice MacDonald, in fact, distinguished himself on the bench, and it was on that basis that he was chosen. And he was chosen from a list compiled by the former government.
Honourable member for Ottawa South.
Let me get this straight, Mr. Speaker.
Order.
Let me get this straight.
I'm sure. Order. I'm sure the Honourable member for Ottawa South appreciates all the assistance with a supplementary question, but we have to be able to hear it. And the Honourable member for Ottawa South now has the floor. Order.
Let me get this straight, Mr. Speaker. Now he blames Mr. Klein for the appointments. The Minister of Justice has appointed Bruce MacDonald as a federal judge, knowing full well he was a top fundraiser for the Minister of Public Safety, a top fundraiser for the Minister of Health, and a top fundraiser for the Prime Minister. Given that one of his key jobs is to uphold the ethical principles of our judges, Mr. MacDonald raised funds for you up until 2004. Will the Justice Minister now admit that his promise to end judicial patronage is nothing but conservative hypocrisy?
Honourable Minister of Justice. Order. The Honourable Minister of Justice has the floor. Order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this was an individual who was chosen on the list by the Judicial Advisory Committee that was put together by that former government. He made the list. In fact, that individual was appointed to the bench by a former government. I haven't heard a lawyer complain about that appointment. All I have seen, Mr. Speaker, is accolades for that appointment, except from the member.
Honourable member for Ottawa Vanier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Those who know full well that the Liberal government spared no effort for linguistic duality, and the Ottawa Francophone community has its hospital today because of its own efforts, but also thanks to the Court Challenges program. The Conservative government chopped it with an axe for the second time. In the current federal cabinet, a number of ministers from the Harris government wanted to do the same thing to the Montfort Hospital. Is that not the source of their small-mindedness and their determination against minorities? The Honourable President of the Treasury Board. I could say directly to my colleague that the political decision was made, went to the Supreme Court of Ontario, and that was made when the Health Minister of Ontario was there, and myself, and we decided not to appeal that decision. And I'm very happy to call Madame Gisèle Lalonde to say that the government, the cabinet, decided that the hospital was very important and should stay open. The Honourable Member for Ottawa-Vanier.
Speaker, because of the program, we managed to save it. And Montfort is just one example of the usefulness of the Court Challenges program. There are others throughout the country. Francophones outside of Quebec and have learned from their experience that the judicial challenge process is necessary and useful to have their rights respected. And I know that the Anglophone minority in Quebec shares that opinion. Why is this government telling both Francophone and Anglophone minority communities that their government will not assist them in upholding their constitutional rights?
The
Honourable President of the Treasury Board.
What we're saying is that Canada's government has a responsibility to uphold the Constitution and our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and we don't have to give grants to Liberal lawyers to get this government to do the right thing. Let's look at what my good friend, the member for Etobicoke Lakeshore, said. He said, and I quote, "I certainly feel overtaxed, and that needs a very rigorous program review. I would look for program review within the government to pull as much savings out as we can." That's the upcoming new leader of the Liberal Party, the member for Etobicoke Lakeshore, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Rosemont-La Petite Patrie. The Environment Commissioner stated that this approach was not going to make it possible to meet Kyoto targets. It has to be a territorial approach. So the sectoral approach is now discredited. So will this government take a step in the right direction by taking a territorial approach where Quebec and provinces will have to reduce by 6% their GHG emissions relative to 1990, Mr. Speaker? The Honourable Minister of the Environment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would remind my colleague once again that our plan goes further than Kyoto, because our priority is the health of all Quebecers and Canadians. So our plan deals with atmospheric pollution, air pollution, and climate change as well. The Honourable Member for Rosemont-La Petite Patrie. Well, we're really anxious to see that future plan that will respect the needs. The NGOs working in this field say that in order to meet Kyoto goals, you have to combine domestic efforts with international efforts, and we're being called upon to help developing countries reduce their emissions too. Does the minister intend to take that recommendation into account in her green plan, which she's been promising to us for several months now, Mr. Speaker? The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
What I can assure the member is that this government will not purchase foreign credits like the last government. And yet another example of Liberal priorities, Mr. Speaker, the former Liberal government gave $5 million to the Asian Development Bank to pay the People's Republic of China to buy foreign credits. Mr. Speaker, $4 million, I gave an example in Kazakhstan last week. This week we've got $5 million to the People's Republic of China, all to buy foreign credits. That money could have gone to buy sewage treatment plants in Canada. It could have gone to pay for anti-pollution technology. That money should be invested at home.
Honourable Member for Montmagny-Lillet, Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup. Mr. Speaker, the government has just announced that the softwood lumber deal would be delayed by 1 month. Under that deal, substantial amounts of money were to be paid back to Quebec companies that are having a difficult time. Can the government guarantee to us that this delay will in no way delay the repayment of the $400 million owing to those companies. The Honourable Minister of Industry. Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to answer this question in the House because everything we've done for the last few months, thanks to the leadership of the Prime Minister, is to have a deal that meets the needs of the forestry industry. That's what we have, and we're aware that this should be implemented as soon as possible, and we're working to that end. The Honourable Minister for Montmagny-Lillet, Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup. Mr. Speaker, beyond that deal, the industry is dealing with an unprecedented crisis and needs other support measures like the Government of Quebec and others have recommended. The Bloc has put forward a multi-point plan to support the industry. Why has the federal government refused to go forward with these Bloc suggestions, if for no other reason than to be dogmatic and to abandon workers to their fate? The Honourable Industry Minister. Mr. Speaker, what we've done is we've negotiated a deal with the Americans, and we've negotiated a deal that is in the interests of Canadians. What's disappointing from the Bloc is that Quebecers know that the Bloc Québécois is in the hallways and could never have negotiated a deal like this. Over 90% of the industry supports the deal. The Bloc Québécois can't meet the needs of Quebecers, and that's why, Mr. Speaker, we've taken action and we have entered into a deal in the interest of the forestry industry. The Honourable Member for West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Country.
Speaker, the Human Resource Minister appointed former Conservative strategist Kevin Godet to the CPP Review Board. Mr. Godet was later forced to resign because of this blatant conflict. But that's not all, Mr. Speaker. The Minister's appointments include 1. The former campaign manager for the member for Winnipeg South, a former Conservative member of Parliament, and a provincial Conservative candidate. Mr. Speaker, why does the Minister insist on appointing her Conservative cronies?
The Honourable Minister of Social Development.
Mr. Speaker,
Order.
It would appear from the questions coming from the opposite side that they seem to think that the only capable person is a Liberal. We know better, Mr. Speaker. We know the Conservatives, in fact, can be even more competent, and we're hiring and choosing our people on the basis of competence and merit, regardless of their political strength.
The Honourable Member for West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky
Well,
Country.
Mr. Speaker, that's embarrassing. Mr. Speaker, the Justice Minister recently appointed the Canadian Alliance candidate Carrie Lynn Finlay to join Canada's Human Rights Tribunal, a body which adjudicates human rights cases. Interesting choice, given that Finlay, running third for the 2005 Conservative nomination in Richmond, BC, threw her support behind Focus on the Family President Darrell Reed, who rallied against, and I quote, the court-led coup that legalized same-sex marriage and even wants to use the notwithstanding clause to overrule the courts. Mr. Speaker, when will the Minister admit he has been caught making an ill-advised appointment and take this human rights appointment from Canadians' Human Rights Tribunal?
The Honourable President of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, we look forward to the Federal Accountability Act being passed by the Liberal Senate, Mr. Speaker. Because, let me tell you, Mr. Speaker, human rights are tremendously important to Canadians. Canadians have heard some very disturbing claims from a front-bench member of the Liberal Party, charging that in the Liberal Party he has faced bigotry and discrimination. I say to the Liberal Party, have you called in anyone to investigate these disgraceful charges made by a member of your own front bench, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Member for Notre-Dame-de-Grâce, Lachine. Mr. Speaker, was it that difficult to find a Conservative to sit on the Human Rights Commission? The Prime Minister said, why not appoint the Reform Alliance extreme right candidate, Ms. Carrie Lynn Finlay? We all know that the Prime Minister believes that the Human Rights Tribunal is affecting our fundamental freedoms, but why appoint Ms. Finlay when she thinks exactly like he does? The Honourable President of Treasury Board.
We believe on this side of the House that appointments should be based on merit. We would believe, Mr. Speaker, there should be greater scrutiny of appointments. That's why the very first piece of legislation we brought forward in this government was the Federal Accountability Act. A Federal Accountability Act which was passed in 71 days we're coming upon the 100th day that the Liberal Senate has had the Federal Accountability Act. Maybe this member, instead of spreading hot air in this chamber, could go down the hall and get her Liberal colleagues, her Liberal friends, to do the right thing, help us clean up corruption, and bring real accountability to the statute books of this nation.
Honourable member, please.
The honourable member for Notre Dame de Grace, Lachine. Order, please. The honourable member has the floor. Mr. Speaker, Canadians are not blind. Appointments to the Pension Review Board were based on political allegiance, and Conservative friends, legal partners, and former bagmen for Conservative leadership candidates were rewarded by the Minister for their work. Why does the Minister feel that this important tribunal is only a means to reward her political friends? The Honourable Minister for Social Development.
You know, it's sounding more and more like the same old from when those people were on this side of the House. In those days, they stacked the committees. Now they're trying to say that only Liberals are capable of sitting and getting these appointments. They're still trying to stack it, Mr. Speaker. We won't have that. We appoint people from all sides of the political spectrum.
The Honourable Member for Charlesbourg, Haute-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, the Minister for International Cooperation and the Francophonie and Official Languages was in Bucharest last week for the 11th Francophonie Summit. The Minister announced a memorandum of understanding between Canada and France. Can she give us the details of this memorandum of understanding? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague for his excellent question. I did last week sign a memorandum of understanding with France on development cooperation, and this is a first for these two countries. France and Canada will work on joint initiatives in Haiti and in Africa, where our two countries are particularly active and committed. Among the other cooperation sectors will be education, governance, the environment, and gender equality. This will help to increase the effectiveness of our aid. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Ottawa Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the Environment Commissioner has documented the massive failure of the former Liberal government on climate change. $6 billion on climate change programs with no effective government-wide system to track expenditures, no performance standards, and no results. My question is to the President of the Treasury Board. What efforts is this government taking to track the missing money? And when is this government going to get Canadians' hard-earned money back and put it where it belongs in cleaning and greening this environment? Thank you, Mr.
Honourable the President of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, I want to be very clear to the member for Ottawa Centre. I am not prepared to stand in my place and defend the mismanagement, financial or otherwise, of the previous Liberal government, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Ottawa Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I might agree the Liberal climate change scandal makes the Liberal sponsorship scandal look like stolen lunch money. This government has no reason for not having a comprehensive, open and accountable plan to get taxpayers' money back. Will the President of the Treasury Board bring in the Auditor General to find out where the climate change money went? Or does this government believe, like the last government, that fighting climate change is a write-off?
The Honourable the President of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, I want to say very directly to the member for Ottawa Centre, what a good idea. Mr. Speaker, as the member from the New Democratic Party knows, one of the most important parts of the Federal Accountability Act is the new power that this government wants to give the Auditor General to follow the money, Mr. Speaker. And I can tell you that those of us on this side of the House will leave no stone unturned to ensure that every dollar fraudulently spent will be returned to hard-working, middle-class families who deserve a break, Mr. Speaker, something that they never got from the Liberal Party opposite.
Honourable member. the honourable member for Halifax West.
Mr. Speaker, the new Vice President of ACOA in New Brunswick is the former Chief of Staff to Elmer McKay and Communications Chief to Bernard Lord. What a coincidence. How can the Minister explain to Canadians that Canada's minority Conservative government is appointing a friend to a senior position at ACOA?
The Honourable the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can't account for the member opposite's lack of friends in this world, Mr. Speaker, but what I can tell you is that this individual, Herm Alvino, who was appointed, spent virtually his entire life serving the people of New Brunswick, first in the federal government, then went back to serve the province of New Brunswick as a very competent, bilingual public servant who has done incredible work throughout his career and is now continuing to do so in his new capacity with Atlantic Canada's Opportunities Agency.
Honourable Member for Halifax West.
Mr. Speaker, first we had this Minister of silly, cheap shots threatening to punish the ridings of MPs who dared to ask him questions in this House. Now, his old friends are the only people who qualify to run ACOA. When will the Prime Minister appoint a full-time minister for ACOA who will not treat a Crown agency as his personal fiefdom?
The Honourable the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Well, Mr. Speaker, what I can tell you is the Atlantic Canada's Opportunities Agency is doing great work for the people of Atlantic Canada. It continues to be a delivery service for many other federal government departments, particularly in the province of New Brunswick. We have seen the efficiency that has been brought about by the head office there in Moncton. And the reality is that this is a member of a party who has a leadership contender that wanted to get rid of ACOA entirely. Take it out as a federal delivery agency for the people of Atlantic Canada. He should apologize in his place.
The Honourable Member for Churchill.
Mr. Speaker, soon after taking office, this government appointed Conservative Harvey Andre as their land claims negotiator for the Northwest Territories. Was it because of his deep ties to the North or his extensive land claims experience? No, because he has none. This sole source $300,000 contract was given because Mr. Andre is a former Conservative cabinet minister. I'd like to ask the Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development who will be the next Conservative at the trough.
The Honourable Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development.
Mr. Speaker, I certainly understand the importance of negotiations involving Canada's First Nations. We have many constitutional issues, devolution issues under discussion. I would, however, counsel the honourable member opposite to approach this matter with some caution because when I became minister, one of the first things I did do was to terminate the contract of a Liberal, the former Premier of Ontario, Mr. Peterson, who was responsible for this file and appointed Mr. Harvey Andre to deal with it in a responsible way, Mr. Speaker, at a fraction of the costs.
Sure, the minister again appreciates the help with his answer, but we have to be able to hear the answer when the minister's asked a question. Now there's going to be a supplementary. Pity the member for Churchill who can't hear the answer. The member for Churchill has the floor. We'll have some order.
Apparently what they meant in the last election was that they would stand up for Canadians who hold Conservative Party memberships. Harvey Andre is just another example of Conservative patronage. Could the minister explain why he chose a negotiator with no land claims experience to represent the federal government in negotiations with the Northwest Territories?
The Honourable the Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development.
Speaker, I'm incredulous at this, actually. The important thing about Mr. Andre is that he's a respected Canadian, a former Privy Councillor, a university professor, a PhD, someone with experience in the North. But the real thing that happened when I became the minister, Mr. Speaker, if I might be allowed to finish, Mr.
We will have some order so the minister can give his answer. Order, please. The minister has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, I can confirm, in response to the question, that I did dismiss Mr. David Peterson, former Liberal Premier of Ontario. I did so because his fees were excessive and his outcomes were non-performing.
The
honourable member for Longueuil, Pierre Boucher. there's a humanitarian crisis that's been aggravated and it affects medical aid. The Auguste Victoria Hospital in Israel cannot continue its operations. Will the Minister for International Cooperation undertake to find some alternative so that these funds will be sent directly to Auguste Victoria Hospital? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I can assure the bloc member that CETA is doing its utmost to help the most underprivileged populations. I will look at this file and I will give her an answer at that time. The Honourable Member for Longueuil-Pierre-Boucher. It seems clear that this government is quicker to cut off the funds than to save lives. Will the Minister follow the example of the European Union, the United States, the UN, and other countries to have some type of temporary aid to the Palestinian civil society? The Honourable Minister of International Cooperation. Mr. Speaker, as the Honourable Member knows full well, CETA always provides its aid through multilateral organizations with pre-established rules. The Honourable Member for Saint-Boniface. Mr. Speaker, last Friday we questioned the President of the Treasury Board on what was said to the effect that his government preferred not to provide money for illiterate adults. His answer was, and I quote, "It isn't asking too much that when people finish high school they know how to read and write." So this is to the President of the Treasury Board. 22% of Canadians don't finish high school, so what do we do with them? Just cast them aside? The Honourable President of Treasury Board.
Question from members opposite was the quotes that attributed to me were in fact not the case, Mr. Speaker. But we believe on those of us on this side of the government, Mr. Speaker. What I said is the comments that he said on Friday that were attributed to me were in fact not. So I say to the member for Wascana, just relax, and maybe members opposite could get the member for Wascana on the question period list for tomorrow, Mr. Speaker. What I do say is that we believe that we've got to work more effectively in the areas of provincial jurisdictions. What we've got to do is ensure that there's no duplicate, that there's no duplication, and ensure that we deliver good results and good value for money for the taxpayers of Canada, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Simcoe North.
Mr. Speaker, street racing is a very serious problem in our communities, often ending with fatal consequences.
Order.
Combating street racing requires action at all levels of government. Now, most provinces impose fines, license suspensions, and vehicle impoundment. I'd like to ask the Minister of Justice just what steps Canada's new government is taking to protect our roads, our highways, and our communities from this serious criminal activity.
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for that very important question. The Conservative government is getting things done for families and taxpayers by sending a strong message to that street racing on Canada's roads and highways will not be tolerated. Bill C-19 creates a separate offence in the criminal code to specifically denounce this type of crime. This proposed amendment increases punishments with regard to minimum driving prohibition and increases periods of imprisonment in street racing situations.
The Honourable Member for New Westminster, Coquitlam.
Recognize that this government is too close to George Bush, especially when it comes to foreign policy. Incredibly, the U.S. Congress is passing a law that will give the President the power to interpret the meaning and application of the Geneva Conventions. Documents show that this government is fully aware of the fact that prisoners we hand over to the Afghans can be given to U.S. authorities. What assurances is this government seeking that prisoners handed over to Afghan authorities are not sent on to Guantanamo Bay or to secret U.S. prisons?
The Honourable, the Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, we've signed a bilateral agreement with the government of Afghanistan, and we've been assured by them that any time a prisoner is detained, that they will be held to the Geneva Convention to the highest standards. As well, the International Center of the Red Cross will be monitoring these detainees. We'll keep track of them at every possible opportunity. I urge the member from the NDP to provide some support for our members in Afghanistan, since they're the ones that are calling for them to cut and run.
The honourable member for New Westminster for
Well, Mr. Speaker, the previous Liberal administration took the U.S. word for it, and look what happened to Mahar Arar. And the Canadians have not asked to follow one single detainee. Canadians want assurances that our soldiers' values and international law are not compromised if Afghani authorities hand over prisoners captured by Canadians to the U.S. Mr. Speaker, in light of what happened to Arar, does this government really trust the U.S. administration to tell the truth about where they hold Canadian captured insurgents?
the Honourable, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Defence.
Mr. Speaker, as I outlined in my earlier answer, we have an agreement with the government of Afghanistan. When detainees are captured, they are passed on to this particular government, and we have been assured by the President of Afghanistan that all necessary treatment and standards are kept so that these detainees are not injured and they're not harmed and they're kept out of harm's way.
The Honourable Member for Oakville.
Mr. Speaker, last week the Treasury Board President justified his mean-spirited cuts to literacy by blaming those with literacy problems. By referring only to high school graduates, he showed his ignorance of the fact that 1 in 7 Canadians is functionally illiterate and that it's a national problem. Has he noticed that even Conservative premiers are protesting his cuts? And why is he abandoning the vulnerable Canadians who need literacy programs the most?
The Honourable, the President of the Treasury Board.
I think in the 35-second answer I spoke of on Friday, what I did say is that governments across Canada spend some $45 billion a year on education and training. We now have labour agreements with all 10 provinces. We work closely with the territories. What we want, Mr. Speaker, is to have every Canadian learn how to read and write. We want every Canadian to be able to make a productive contribution to Canadian society. And the very best way to do that, Mr. Speaker, is for the federal government to accept his jurisdiction and for the federal government to work with the provinces to ensure that we reduce overlap and duplication, whether it comes primary, secondary, or adult training of education, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Saskatoon-Humboldt.
Mr. Speaker, since lighting accounts for about 5% of Canadian electricity consumption, will the Minister of Natural Resources please inform this House what he is doing to promote the development of clean technologies for Canadian homes and businesses?
Good question. The Honourable, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. I'm proud to be able to say today that the government has invested $2.1 million in lighting research using semiconductors, and thanks to this research, we can have bulbs that will last 20 years and use 96% less than the current bulbs. And this is the type of technology that we will continue to support. Canadians want results. They want things to move forward. Canadians want their money's worth, and that's what we are delivering, and not hollow words.
Timmins James Bay.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives campaigned on a promise to increase funding for our woefully underfunded museums.
Yeah.
They broke that promise. But not only that, the Minister of Treasury Board singled out Canadian museums for attack with drastic cuts, saying he was going after programs that were, quote, wasteful, inefficient, and completely out of touch with average Canadians. Now, I know the Heritage Minister's been like an absentee landlord when it comes to articulating the value of heritage and culture, but I'd like to ask the Minister of Treasury Board, what is it about our Canadian museums that ticked him off so much that he set after them, saying that they're wasteful and inefficient?
Honourable, the Parliamentary Secretary and the Minister of Canadian Heritage. Order.
Of course, Mr. Speaker, I'm rather surprised at my friend just distorting the comments that the Minister made. The fact of the matter is that our government spends $241 million a year on museums. I don't know where he comes up with his assertion.
The Honourable Member for Gaspésie-Île-de-la-Madeleine. Mr. Speaker, the Minister responsible for Economic Development Canada for regions of Quebec announced a program with no new money to the detriment of coastal communities related to fisheries. The initiative for this had $34 million in the past over 5 years. Now this money's disappeared. Will the Minister responsible for Economic Development Canada tell us whether he decided that there is no more problem in the fishing communities, which justifies the disappearance of $34 million in this sector? The Honourable Minister of Labour. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What we did, Mr. Speaker, for the people in the Gaspé and for that entire region, Gaspésie-de-la-Madeleine, is to give them 6 new tools, including the one just mentioned, called IDEC Vitalité. Contrary to the former program, which was only about fisheries, this time we're associating this with non-reimbursable loans, that is, a contribution, and a part that is a reimbursable loan but no interest. That's a better tool, especially for people in the fisheries who need more funds when they have significant large ventures.
I would like to draw to the attention of honourable members the presence in the gallery of the Honourable Bill Bennett, Minister of State for Mining for British Columbia. Again, obviously he needs no introduction. Order, tabling of documents. The Honourable Member for Wascana is rising on a point of order.
Mr. Speaker, two points arising from question period. First of all, on I believe it was at least 4 separate occasions, the Minister of Justice, in response to questions with respect to judicial matters, referred to certain lists from which judges were appointed. I wonder if the Minister of Justice would be kind enough to table those lists in the House of Commons.
Your list, Denny.
Apparently not. The member for Wascana.
The silence speaks volumes, Mr. Speaker. A second point arising from question period. There was, from the government, toward the end of question period, a specific question dealing with the issue of street racing. I would simply point out, Mr. Speaker, that is an item that is covered by the bill that is presently being debated before this House, and accordingly, I would think that question would be out of order.
It was a softball.
The Honourable the Minister of Justice.
Well, Mr. Speaker, first of all, my learned friend knows, in fact, that the lists that are compiled by the Judicial Advisory Committees. It was the Judicial Advisory Committees, in fact, are comprised of Liberal government appointees. And my learned friend knows, my colleague knows, that those lists are confidential. If he chooses to go to the Privacy Commissioner and demand that those lists be released, contrary to the undertakings that the former government gave, they're welcome to do that.
The Honourable Member for Wascana.
Mr. Speaker, in fairness, I think the Minister of Justice would want to acknowledge that those judicial advisory committees include nominees of all provincial governments in Canada, the Chief Justices of Canada, the Bar Association of each of the provinces, and the Canadian Bar Association. Mr. Speaker, they are not Liberal committees.
The Minister of Justice is rising on the same point again.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it was their Minister of Justice who placed those individuals onto the committees. There is nothing there. In fact,
order. The Minister of Justice is responding to the issue raised by the member for Wascana will hear the Minister of Justice in his response.
In fact, the Justice Advisory Committees are compiled by the former government. There's no statute, there's no regulation that indicates who should be on those committees. It was entirely on the part of the former Liberal government as who is going to be on the committee.
Exactly.
That's true.
Order. While I have no doubt that members appreciate the exchange of views on this important subject, I don't think it's a matter for intervention by the Chair. The Honourable Minister of Justice did not read from the list. He simply pointed out the name had come from a list. So I don't think there's a requirement for tabling of such a document at this time. And while I'm sure the debate has been of interest, we'll move on to the next point, which l'honorable député.
The honourable member for Ottawa-Vanier also has a point of order. Yes, Mr. Speaker. You will recall, Mr. Speaker, a few days ago, the President of the Treasury Board, in response to a question put to him during question period, quoted passages from letters that had been sent to him or signed by the Ethics Commissioner, Mr. Shapiro. Since these parts of these letters were quoted, I would like to ask the government to table these letters in the House so that we can all see them. That was over a week ago, and we're still waiting for the tabling of these documents by the government, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable President of the Treasury Board. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I did quote a letter written by Mr. Shapiro to our colleague, the member for Malpec on your side.
The
honourable member for Ottawa-Vanier. Well, Mr. Speaker, regardless who this was addressed to, the minister who's quoting a document must table it unless last time there was a prime minister who'd quoted it, and they invoked national security for not tabling the document. It was a cabinet document. Well, this time it's a letter signed by Mr. Shapiro, the Ethics Commissioner, to the President of the Treasury Board, who used it as an answer at question period. So regardless, it should be tabled in the House. The Honourable President of the Treasury Board. Mr. Speaker, I stated very clearly it will be my pleasure to provide the letter to the House.
Order. Well, the minister's given his undertaking. We'll find out when he tables the document. Now, with respect... Order. With respect to the point of order raised by the honourable member for Wascana concerning the question put during the question period today, I'd refer honourable members to Marlowe and Montpetit, page 477, where this paragraph occurs. At one time, members were also prohibited from asking a question during question period if it was in anticipation of an order of the day. This was to prevent the time of the House being taken up with business to be discussed later in the sitting. In 1975, the rule was relaxed in regard to questions asked during question period when the order of the day was either the budget debate or the debate on the address and reply to the speech from the throne, as long as questions on these matters did not monopolize the limited time available during question period. In 1983, the Speaker ruled that questions relating to an opposition motion on a supply day could also be put during question period. In 1997, the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs recommended in a report to the House that questions not be ruled out of order on this basis alone. The Speaker subsequently advised the House that the Chair would follow the advice of the committee. And I refer honourable members to the footnotes to that paragraph which indicate that the Speaker made this statement on April 7, 1997 at page 9,377 of the debates. And accordingly, I think the question is probably in order.